Anarchists want to abolish prison. But how does that work? And what would we do with all the criminals? Prison abolition doesn't mean we allow criminals to hurt people and run free. It's about finding new ways to prevent crime. And if a crime is committed, thinking of different methods of dealing with those criminals without locking them in a cage like animals. Prison does very little, if anything, to actually prevent crime. And in its modern form, it's nothing more than a rebrand of state oppression and slave labor. An entire industry built on collecting and caging human beings. Depriving people of food, subjecting them to constant threats of death and violence doesn't make anyone better. It only creates in them more anger and hostility towards a society that threw them away. Even if someone has to have their freedoms temporarily taken from them to save the lives of other people, it doesn't mean that we have to subject them to cruel and unusual punishment. We believe in giving those people proper resources and tools to actually bring them back into society, using a system built on rehabilitative, not punitive justice.
I've noticed that many people who claim to be ex-radfems criticize radical feminism for not being what they deem as radical enough. They like to treat feminism as a broad form of activism that should address all issues, which illustrates how misogyny on its own is never treated as a big enough problem to have its own dedicated solution. Intersectionality is often treated as an excuse to dilute feminism, instead of as a way to view the different experiences women have as a result of an intersection of their identities. It is estimated that approximately 31% of women overall will experience domestic abuse at one point in their lives. However, the prevalence of domestic abuse is even higher among Black women, with more than 40% estimated to experience such abuse. Black women face higher maternal mortality rates than other women in the U.S. Rape statistics are similarly unequal, with Black women facing higher rates of rape than any other race in the United States. It is due to an intersection of race and sex that Black women are treated this way. Change either the race or the gender, and the experience completely changes. In the same way that Black women were abused in ways specific to their sex as slaves due to their reproductive ability, Black women today face specific experiences of abuse because they are Black females. Therefore, their treatment and issues fall under the purview of feminism and requires an adjustment in how those issues are addressed, and acknowledgement that these experiences may differ from those of other women to some degree. In the same way that sex-selective abortions and femicide might be of greater concern to Chinese and Indian feminists, but still fall under women's-only issues, so too does those previously mentioned high rates of racialized female abuse. After all, the ways in which Black women are harmed are female-centered methods. It is for this reason that other causes like prison abolition, or Marxism, or anarchy do not fall under feminism's purview. There are views which may merge or overlap, but the main focus of any kind of feminism is women's liberation. This becomes especially obvious when listening to liberal men whose actions are still misogynistic, or illustrate that gender inequality still exists within their ideologies. It is for this reason that I staunchly disagree with abolishing the police or prison abolition, as both movements are radical, but directly at odds with actually helping women or women's liberation. Prison abolition is a naive attempt at addressing the inequalities and inhumane treatment in prisons, without acknowledging that some crimes are not poverty-driven, and that some people are not suited to live publicly without supervision. Prison abolitionists seek transformative action wherein rehabilitation via community efforts are the main goal. One argument is that nonviolent crime is fueled by the need for societal change and are primarily driven by poverty. Dorothy Roberts, law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, cited the relationship between prisons and the foster care system, noting that for youthful offenders in impoverished, disinvested, and Black neighborhoods, foster care is sometimes a step in a pipeline leading to involvement in the justice system. She argues that police intervention is often used in situations which were unnecessary and unneeded, which adds to the cycle of poverty. For this reason, Roberts called the foster care system the family destruction system. While it is true that a poverty cycle exists and that systemic need for change is required to address poverty-stricken crimes, these arguments are often vague and do not give substantial solutions that are both applicable and possible to lobby for. Prison reform, like changing the bail system or getting rid of inhumane punishments like solitary confinement, are often considered not enough. And of course, what about the murderers and rapists? Abolitionist Angel Parker writes, "When people ask me what we will do with the rapists and murderers if we abolish the prison industrial complex, including prisons and police, I typically respond, what are we doing with them now? The original question itself requires unpacking. To ask, what will we do about the rapists and murderers, implies that rapists and murderers primarily make up the 2.3 million people currently incarcerated, not inclusive of people impacted by mandates, probation, parole, and incarceration. The underlying implication is that prison is a place where dangerous people go to be held accountable for their poor choices. If this were the case, then the fact that Black and Indigenous folks and immigrants primarily make up the prison population means that we are predisposed to dangerous behavior and poor choices. Yet we know that this is not the case. So before we dive deeper into this question, I want us to challenge the subconscious thought. Prison is not a place for bad people. In the U.S., prison is a system of white supremacist capitalism. It functions, essentially, to disappear unwanted populations. In the 19th century, much of the discourse surrounding how to solve the Negro problem in place of slavery was to ship Black people to Liberia. This was because the white liberals did not want us in this country. They believed us to be beneath them and unable to live peacefully beside them. White conservatives did not want us in this country if we were not providing free labor. Consequently, the carceral system has exploded since the end of slavery. Being that prisons and police are legacies of slavery, and we know that Black folks do not commit more crimes than other populations, and make up a large part of the prison population, I'd like us to turn, firstly, to rape and sexual assault. Rape and sexual assault are the most underreported crimes in this country. Only about 6% of rapists will ever serve a single day in jail, and only around 0.7% of rapes end in a felony conviction. This fact speaks to why I respond, "What are we doing with them now?" when asked about what about the rapists. Because the answer is essentially nothing. In fact, there are many more survivors of rape and sexual assault in prison than there are rapists themselves. The vast majority of people who are raped by somebody they know personally. This matters when the carceral system is designed as the proper means of accountability. While some survivors seek justice via the carceral system, most survivors do not. This can be for several reasons. Some reasons could be the person is their family member, they don't want to break up the person's family by sending them to jail. They are embarrassed, they don't want to be obligated to relive the traumatic experience in a public space, etc. There are many people who don't want their rapist to go to jail. They want the rape and abuse to stop. They want to prevent it from happening to anyone else. Furthermore, many states have statutes of limitations for sex crimes. The carceral system exposes its own lack of genuine care and accountability to survivors of rape and sexual assault. As such, if 94% of rapists are not incarcerated, yet by sending people to incarceration we are guaranteeing sexual violence, it does not make sense to continue to ruin the lives of millions of people and their families in the name for survivors. Not only is this completely void of reality, it is wildly offensive to the survivors of sexual violence who are incarcerated right now.
Shit, bro, okay. I'm sorry you went through that, but that's not how you structure a society.
Domestic violence victim here. If theoretically I never saw my abuser again, and they got incarcerated and then continued to live a normal life, I would not be able to live with myself. And the reason why is because I would live in fear every single day thinking about if he was about to create another victim. I hate him with every fiber of my being, and frankly, I never want to see him again. But what trauma has been done to me is what's done. So the biggest justice I can ask for is knowing securely that he will not create any more victims.
So first, she deflects by making prison itself to be solely a racism problem. Jails have existed in all countries as a result of having societies which operate with a system of laws that requires punishments to be enforced. It is true that more Black people are incarcerated for crimes, many of which are poverty-stricken. In some cases, they might benefit from rehabilitation and job training, and for addressing income inequality, it's possible. Systemic racism is certainly a thing, and many issues are obvious, such as higher sentencing and overrepresentation in prisons, among others. However, the argument that the higher rates of incarceration for Black people in relation to violent crimes solely highlight an injustice in prosecution fails to consider the possibility of overlooked prosecutions for those crimes among other racial groups. If race plays such a large role regarding incarceration, namely in lowered sentences, why wouldn't it impact which crimes get investigated or prosecuted to begin with? Additionally, this ignores the gendered nature of crimes. It's been a long-standing conclusion in criminology that women are more likely to commit non-violent crimes, as well as less crimes in general. As Sonia Sadha wrote in The Guardian, the vast majority of violence is committed by men, more than 4/5 of violent crime and an even greater proportion of sex offenses. While men are also more likely to be victims of violent crime, women are overwhelmingly more likely to be victims of severe domestic abuse. According to a report by the UK Parliament, women currently represent less than 5% of the total prison population. a level which has remained consistent over the past 5 years. Because cases of violence are so much rarer in the female population, those few cases of female violence are often given more media attention, which in turn sensationalizes them. A story of a woman abusing a man is common. Meanwhile, women are abused, murdered, and raped every day by male perpetrators, but no media source is able to cover every single situation. Not only have we gotten blind to the concept, but we have normalized it. Men are violent towards women enough that we just don't see it. However, this false equivalence that women are often as bad as men allows for this argument that race is the major issue in prison inequality, when truthfully, we have a male violence problem that prison abolition can't address.
Alright, baby, let's talk about accountability and consequences. A common misconception about abolition is that without police and prisons, there'll be no response to people harming each other. But abolition doesn't mean that there won't be consequences for people's actions. It means that the prison industrial complex creates unnatural consequences that are excessively and unequally applied, which actually reproduces harm instead of reducing it. In an abolitionist world, not only do we create the conditions for people to harm each other less, but we also create opportunities for people to take accountability for their actions when harm inevitably occurs. Taking accountability is an active process of admitting harm or wrongdoing, accepting the consequences, and making changes to behavior towards the goal of harm not happening again. Notice that consequences are an important part of that process, but they are just a part of that process.
How are you going to be accountable to someone who's dead? How are you going to be able to make it up to someone who you've murdered or raped? How do you become accountable for that? What consequences are you going to get if they're not enforced by some sort of system? And on top of that, the idea that like I guess if it's like stealing or something, you can work it off. But when it comes to violent crime, if the person is injured or harmed in a horrible way, what consequence is going to happen unless it is enforced? What if the person doesn't feel remorse? What if they don't want to take it back? That whole idea is so really, it's so naive to me. You're assuming that everyone in jail is there for like weed or small level offenses, when the truth is there are people who are there for murdering their whole family, for raping people, for spending years raping people. How do you do accountability for someone like that? How?
Whereas punishment focuses all of our energy on those consequences. But what if somebody refuses to take accountability? Do they just get away with it? Nah, of course not. When you live in a community, not only do harmful actions come with natural consequences, but refusing to take accountability is also a harmful action that should come with consequences. That'll vary between different communities and be different based on what the harm was and who's involved, but any justice framework that is letting people off the hook and not holding them accountable for their actions is not abolitionist by definition.
Secondly, she argues that because some of the victims of rape and domestic assault would prefer not to disturb the status quo or to see their abusers imprisoned, that rapists and women batterers should remain free. This argument ignores that abuse is complicated and doesn't always allow for the most rational response to trauma. It places public safety and the safety of victims as being less important to the emotional response of the victim. And of course, it ignores what prison is meant to do. It is meant to both rehabilitate and punish criminals for their actions, as well as to serve as a deterrent to others who might do the same, and to protect public safety. It is not always successful in these cases, but regardless of how the individual feels about it, abusing another person should not be condoned just because the abused forgives them. And of course, her suggestion that the law system is not able to perfectly handle cases of assault and abuse and should therefore be thrown away altogether is just mind-bogglingly stupid. The premise ignores that rapists are not misled or undereducated. It ignores that rape is not born from sexuality but from a flaunting of power. It ignores the fact that men do, in fact, understand what no means but choose to ignore it, and therefore should be punished for knowingly hurting someone else.
This is part 2, by the way. A lot of what I see in defense of the prison system looks like this. It's basically like, it's a public safety measure. We need prison. And I think that this is American brain and its consequences. Not to sound like a social democrat, but if you look at Nordic countries where prisoners are allowed to walk free, they have significantly less crime than us and less recidivism.
Norway only has a maximum sentence of 21 years. And yes, they do have a big emphasis on rehabilitation. So after spending time in prison, they give you training. They often have open prisons. And all that is great and dandy. But the issue is, when it comes to stuff like murder, a lot of the times it's a personal issue. So you killed your ex-wife, now she's dead. You're not planning on killing anyone else because you only did it because you didn't like your ex-wife. There is no justice in that for me, because first off, there's just no justice in ignoring that a crime happened and not having a real punishment. I appreciate that their prisons are a lot more humane, and that's what I mean by prison rehabilitation, by prison reform. But why would you let somebody who killed 100 teenagers come out of prison in 21 years? And that's perfectly fine. They took 100 lives, and there is no justification for that. There is no making it better for those lives or for the families of those people. There is no way to make it up to the person you did that crime to, and the same thing goes for murder and for rape. You can make it up if you commit a white-collar crime, if you steal something, crash a car, but I don't think you can do that when it comes to something like murder or rape. And that's where I and prison reformists really disagree on, because I do believe in punitive justice. I do think that if you do a bad thing, you should be punished. If I did something bad as a child, I was punished for it, and then I learned not to do it again. And yeah, you might not agree with the reason why I was punished. I might not agree with, reading past bedtime was a thin thing I wanted to do, boo-hoo. But there has to be a consequence for going against cultural and social norms. There has to be a consequence for hurting other people.
Why? I think because in America, we just don't talk about what prison is actually like, and we love to put it out of sight, out of mind. People are just comfortable with it existing so long as they never really have to come into contact with it. But no, we have to come to terms with the fact that this is deeply unethical. You are removing a person from society. I cannot recommend Angela Davis's lectures and writings on this topic enough. Please. Statements like these that make sense in your head don't play out like that in real life. What we're doing has been proven to be ineffective. The numbers don't lie.
Points such as 87% of incarcerated women are survivors of domestic assault only illustrate the gender divide in criminal offenses and in the background of criminals. Most male criminals do not have the background of abuse. Treating male and female criminals the same is the issue here, particularly as the reasoning and severity of their crimes differs greatly. As a feminist, I can only see prison abolition as a stepping stone to increase victimization of women with decreased consequences. I'm not alone in this critique either. Rachel Barkow, who served as a member of the U.S. Sentencing Commission from 2013 to 2019 and is the author of Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration, notes 3 concerns of prison abolition based on the deinstitutionalization movement of the 60s and 70s, which sought to return the mentally ill to community centers or to their homes and to shut down mental hospitals. Number 1, it's easier to end something than to fund something. Deinstitutionalization advocates were able to close hospitals, but weren't able to redirect funding to community health centers and other suggested alternatives. Similarly, there's no guarantee that prison abolitionists will be successful because it will require massive amounts of funding to address the root causes of crime, which is the core of their agenda. 2, there's a need to be attentive to variation in the population you want to help. Deinstitutionalization advocates ignored that some people had serious mental health issues because it didn't fit into their narrative of mental hospitals not being needed, which ignores that many people did need custodial care. As a result of not being in favor with advocates, those people fell through the cracks, and it's one of the big reasons why so many people with serious mental health problems are homeless and in need of care today. As Barkow points out, prison abolitionists face a similar issue because they focus on people who commit crimes because of structural inequality. They argue that if we fix those root causes, we won't have crime. Unfortunately, though, that is not the only cause of crime. We have people who harm others because of greed, lust, jealousy, vengeance, religious and political ideology, and any other number of factors. Structural fixes won't stop that, so there needs to be a societal response that deals with people who would harm others for those reasons. And 3, relying on the community might not work. Prison abolition often relies on the assumption that the community will step up and help. Deinstitutionalization advocates thought the same, but that community support didn't materialize. And here's the thing. If someone releases a child abuser, domestic violence perpetrator, or rapist into the community's not going to want to support them. There are cases where it happens, but if someone moves in next door and I learn about this, I'm not there to support them. I'm going to hate them. I'm going to want them dead. This idea that everyone's just a matter of structural inequality ignores the fact that we have cultural norms for a reason, and that if you go against those norms, people won't like you. In addition to these criticisms, it's important to note that recidivism is an issue with many violent crimes. For example, in a Canadian study which analyzed data from 2001, it was found that 1 in 3, 32% of offenders, were reconvicted of a criminal offense following the indexed domestic violence conviction. Due to a lack of trust between the victims and law enforcement, it is important to note that many crimes may be underreported. Regarding domestic violence alone, experts estimate that recidivism rates actually fall anywhere from 39 to 66%. Underreporting is also an issue of sexual crimes, both for initial reporting and for recidivism after conviction. As his Fondi Law Group points out, sexual recidivism rates are commonly found to be between 10 to 15% after 5 years, 20% after 10 years, and 30 to 40% after 20 years in follow-up studies. However, not all crimes are reported, and thus these estimates are likely low. There are a myriad of cases where a man is let out of jail and commits another violent crime that could have been convicted. We have Daryl Warren, who was out of prison only 6 months before he was accused of murder. He had spent 19 years in state custody after pleading no contest to allegations that he stabbed his girlfriend 14 times and her 10-year-old son once in 1993. He was released in April 2014 and married by August. But by October, he faced a charge of first-degree murder, accused of killing his new bride. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Barbara Wilson, 59. With the plea, he avoided the death penalty, but he will return to prison where he spends the rest of his life. In August 2022, a man charged in the killings of at least 3 of the 4 Muslim men killed in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was reported to have a history of arrest for domestic violence. Limpopo police reported in January 2023 that a 33-year-old woman was murdered allegedly by her husband a day after she withdrew a domestic violence case against him. And in November of 2022, a mom of 3 was executed in front of her kids less than 24 hours after her estranged husband was sprung from jail on a no bail over a caught-on-camera beatdown she'd posted to her Facebook page in a desperate plea for help. Adam Benefield, 45, who had a prior conviction for kidnapping another ex at gunpoint, was charged with shooting dead his 30-year-old wife, Kiera Benefield. And to be quite unprofessional, I believe that many crimes can be a consequence of circumstance. One can steal if they're hungry, or murder to protect themselves or an innocent. However, rape and domestic abuse are inexcusable. There is no justification that can forgive those crimes. With the rates of conviction and difficulty of sexual crimes getting to court, let alone sentencing, if you have been convicted of rape, the punishment should be castration, if not death. I can admit that this response doesn't take into account that governments allowed to kill their constituents under certain circumstances may abuse that power. But with what I have seen and read and researched, that is what a just world would look like to me. Prison abolition seems to me to ignore the possibility of reform and, in turn, alienates many potential supporters. Many people would agree that solitary confinement is unfair, that housing men and women is unjust, and that the severe lack of female prisons creates an unfair burden and separation on families. Other countries have humane systems which have jails that don't use slave labor and offer a decent place to live.
This is what Swedish prisons look like. Their reoffending rate is so low they keep needing to.
One of the most American moments in my reading life is when I was reading this book, Bola, by Pashtim Sarovici. It's a really great book, and I really was enjoying it up until the moment when the main character goes to prison. And the description of the prison was so unlike anything I had ever really considered in my life. And I was thinking, how could he possibly get it wrong? How would he make this prison so humane, where the warden helps the convict get books and then reestablishes his life outside of jail? And then I realized that the writer was born in Kosovo, but his family got refugee status in Finland. He writes in Finnish. He's writing about a Finnish prison. And it was my American cultural delusion that snapped when I read that part.
Other countries allow low-level offenders to leave prison during the day or to be housed with their kids. Those are options, and those are obtainable. However, I've noticed that at times, radical movements like this refuse to acknowledge that less severe solutions exist and would serve their movement just as well. At times, it seems like they are radical for the sake of being radical, oppositional for the sake of being counterculture. Prison abolition is directly at odds with feminism because it ignores many aspects of material reality that occur due to sex differences. Instead of attempting to address these concerns, as radical feminism has many different viewpoints and writers, it ignores them. Those who lump the two together on account of conservatives hating both don't recognize that just because two groups are hated by another, it doesn't necessarily make them allies. This, dear viewers, is where we part. This was going to be a longer video with the police aspect, but that's gonna have to be another video because we're already at like 20 minutes without the TikToks added in. I took a criminal psychology course back in, I don't know, sophomore year of college. And I remember this discussion because my professor was like, oh, well, sexual offenders don't have high rates of recidivism. Well, first off, we don't know that because we are aware that sex crimes are underreported and under-prosecuted. So I think there's a hell of a lot more than you're just not listening to. But instead of just, I don't know, addressing the fact that we are not currently taking those cases seriously, instead of trying to restructure to address that better, the answer they want to give is, let's just get rid of jail altogether. Which, to me, people like to argue about stuff like, oh, well, the sex offender list doesn't actually solve anything, it just isolates them. I don't care. You committed an awful, horrible crime, now suffer. And I get that's not like the most pacifistic way to address that, but when you commit crimes that hurt other people, you're supposed to be punished for it. Do you have no way to know if there's an afterlife where someone else will do the punishing? It falls to our societies which have rules which are established and work because we are aware that there are punishments, there are consequences. That's what has to treat these issues. And you're saying that no, it's fine, everyone's just misunderstood and they just didn't know better. I also think that it's a little bit demeaning to assume that just every single black person in jail is there just because of systemic inequality. Committing crimes is a choice. There is systemic inequality, and there are ways to address that in community-based whatevers. But you're also ignoring that violent crime exists, and that not everyone in prison is there for stealing bread. Two things can be true at the same time. We need to address systemic inequality in prisons, which is racially motivated. We need to stop this over-incarceration. But we don't need to get rid of prisons altogether. We still need a place to put the people who are not suited for public life, where they will abuse and kill and hurt other people. Anyhow. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm gonna see if I can get the police one out tomorrow, so there'll be like a double feature. Let me know in the comments what you think. This is definitely a topic, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. See you guys next time. Bye.